Hello there. This is All 24 News special coverage on Russia-Ukraine, coming to you live from Algiers. I'm your host, Karim Fez Zachary. Here's what's on tap today. Entering the 6th month of war, Ukraine is facing thorny dilemmas. The Ukrainian military said it had detected large-scale Russian bombing in eastern Ukraine on Sunday night and said Moscow was continuing to prepare for an attack on Bakhmut in the industrial Donbas region, which Russia wants to control on behalf of the separatist Russian Defense Ministry. Officials also insisted that a strike on the port of Odessa, less than a day after Russia and Ukraine signed an agreement on resuming grain shipments from there, had hit only military targets. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who is on a tour in Africa, said his country will help Ukrainian people to get rid of the regime that he described as an anti-people and anti-historical. The head of the Russian diplomacy reassures to alleviate the risk of a food crisis. The agreement signed Friday in Istanbul between Russia and Ukraine under the aegis of the UN provides for the establishment of secure corridors to allow the circulation in the Black Sea of merchant ships, which Moscow and Kyiv undertake not to attack. To delve further into the topic, I am joined live via Skype by Franak Vyakoka, Chief Advisor of Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya from Belarus, along with Dr. Greg Simons, Associate Professor at Uppsala University from Sweden. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. The discussion right after this. So to update you, dear viewers and dear guests, Ukraine has been pushing ahead with efforts to restart grain exports despite missile strikes on its biggest port on Saturday. Russia has admitted it launched the attack on Odessa and says it was trying to hit military targets. The attack has raised doubts over Russia's willingness to respect a crucial agreement to unblock Ukrainian port. Ukraine's president says forces were advancing towards the southern region of Kherson, which Russia occupied earlier. More in this report, and then we get back to discussion.
As Russian forces captured more of the two provinces, which together make up Ukraine's industrial Donbas region, Ukrainian officials are planning a counter-offensive to retake Russian-occupied areas in the south. A Ukrainian army commander has said it would be impossible for Russia to take over Kharkiv. Amid speculations, Moscow may be planning to take the country's second-largest city.
They don't have enough forces to take the Kharkiv region, but our operative intelligence say that they will be trying to surround Kharkiv and the Kharkiv region.
Less than a day after Russia and Ukraine signed an agreement on resuming grain shipments from Odessa, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that any ships coming to Ukrainian ports to pick up additional grain would be inspected to make sure they don't bring any weapons. In turn, Russian Defense Ministry officials insisted that a strike on the port of Odessa had hit only military targets. In the Donbas regions, tens of thousands of people who evacuated from Ukraine's eastern Donetsk are returning to homes close to the front line because they can't afford to live in safe places. The office of the mayor of Pokrovsk estimated that 70% of those who evacuated have come home.
They gave us food. We had everything in the evacuation, but it was temporary. But then they told us to go to a nursing home. My son refused.
This comes as Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is on a tour to Africa in an attempt to reassure the continuation of Russian grain supplies amid uncertainty over a deal to resume Ukrainian exports from the Black Sea.
So let's kick it off with you, Mr. Franak. Ukraine on Monday continued efforts to restart grain exports through Black Sea ports under a deal aimed at the easing of the global food shortage crisis. But said the weekend bombing of Odessa port by Russian forces posed a threat to the shipments. How do you read this development? Do you think that this could actually hinder the deal?
Yeah, Russia and Putin deliberately undermined the results of negotiations. They undermined the role of the UN. They neglected everything that was discussed a few days before. This is also the kind of message like, we don't care about what you agree about international norms and regulations. If we want to bomb Odessa port, we will do this. And you can't do anything in response. This comes from the impunity that Putin and Russia faced for many, many years. It was trying to undermine sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, of Georgia, and it never faced serious consequences. And perhaps right now, Russia also hopes that the West, the international organizations such as UN, will not respond properly.
And Dr. Greg Simons, many analysts are saying that after this attack, as a peace deal seems really far off. How do you read this?
This attack, Ukraine has been hiding different military objects and civilian things in the past, and this has been uncovered. So one cannot exclude that possibility. And this comes down into this peace deal. There is not going to be one in the immediate future, namely because Ukraine is not in a position to do so. For whenever it does make noises about peace deals, the United States and the United Kingdom visit, and then any peace talks are off. So in this regard, Ukraine is more of an object than a subject in this game, even though they're doing the fighting and losing the soldiers. And of course, the longer it goes on fighting, the greater the cost in terms of what Russia is likely to expect. They're militarily stronger and are winning this military part of the conflict.
And Dr. Greg Simons, is it normal to have a military ship there in the port, perhaps for protection? And just like some analysts, they said that this is just a pretext that Russia is using to target military ships in the port, whose presence is essential according to Ukrainian authorities.
Well, the point is, if you have a military object in a civilian area, it is no longer subject to protection because you have a military object there, which renders the civilian object, which would otherwise be protected, unprotected. So, this is the legal aspect of this.
And how about you, Mr. Franek? How do you find the comments of our distinguished guest?
I totally disagree. I think it's Ukrainian territory, it's Ukrainian seaport, and Ukraine has the right to defend its seaport, its ship, its sea border, and it's absolutely natural that Ukrainians protecting their own land, and Russians don't have any right to shoot Ukrainian territory, Ukrainian objects, Ukrainian seaports. And I think let's not confuse that who is the aggressor here, who is guilty in this war. It's Putin's war. He started attacking Ukraine in February because he wanted to restore a great Russian empire, to fulfill his imperial ambitions. And this is the reason why so many people in Ukraine are suffering, why so many people could suffer from hunger because of Russian aggression.
Dr. Greg Simons, why do you think Russia would target such ships in Ukrainian territories? Is it a threat perhaps of some kind of a Trojan horse?
Well, of course. Ukraine has been having Trojan horses, as has been proven. They've been hiding military objects in shopping malls and all kinds of things. If you have a military object within a civilian port, it is a legitimate target during time of war. If that ship was a civilian ship, it's another matter. And these are the clear rules of war. This is a war, and it doesn't matter who's the aggressor and who's not the aggressor. This is how things are conducted. If we look back to the different wars the Americans have fought, they've been far less discriminate in terms of their bombings. We just need to look at what has happened in Iraq, for example, when purely civilian targets were leveled.
Very nice indeed. And Mr. Franak, in the Donbas region, tens of thousands of people who evacuated from Ukraine's eastern Donetsk are actually returning home because they can't afford to live in safer places. What kind of fate do you think these residents are going to face?
So people are moving and relocating or being displaced not because of good life. They are looking for stability. They are looking for peace. And right now, temporary administrations on occupied territory, they cannot provide them with safety and peace. I can say about refugees to Belarus. Many of them who were moved from occupied by Russia territories to Belarus, up to 50,000, many of them returned back because the conditions in Belarus for refugees are very, very bad, and Lukashenko's regime does not provide them even with basic support, basic assistance. Of course, that's a huge tragedy. It's a huge catastrophe, humanitarian catastrophe for all these people who just became the hostage of this horrible Russian aggression.
And Dr. Greg Simons, do you think that the world leaders owe these residents something?
Well, I mean, they have been giving them something. I mean, look at Poland and Romania have been taking a huge number of refugees. I mean, certainly the US, which could have contributed to preventing this war, which did not, is doing very little beyond supplying weapons which merely perpetuate and escalate the war. So, but my feeling is that there are two things at play, that soon there is a tendency for refugees, no matter what their plight, there is a drop in sympathy and empathy after a while. And one can also see a number of the refugees, this is in Sweden, but I've also seen in Latvia, that are returning to Ukraine because their life there was better than what they receive, even in a place like Sweden.
And Dr. Greg Simon still, Moscow has charged 92 members of the Ukrainian armed forces with crimes against humanity. And this is according to the head of Russia's investigative committee. And Ukraine is also conducting its own war crimes investigations. Do you think that perhaps there should be a fairer trial that is perhaps backed by the UN?
You're seeing is the problem of the politics of war. War in any form is deeply political, and it's reliant on the sense of legitimacy and lack of legitimacy. So this is a positioning by both Russia and Ukraine to legitimize themselves and delegitimize the others. In terms of the UN, well, first of all, let's see what the results are of the UN and getting the grain shipments moving again in order to deal with this potential food shortage crisis.
What about you, Mr. Franak? How do you find these war crimes trials in both countries?
It's very important that international investigation has been launched, and it's very possible that in the next few months, the International Tribunal on Russian war crimes in Ukraine will be opened. There were multiple evidence of war crimes and human rights crimes that were collected by human rights defenders. And when tribunal will be launched, there is a high probability that many officers, many people from Putin's environment, Putin's circles, but also Lukashenko himself and his cronies will be brought to justice. Of course, it's very unlikely they will be in person at the tribunal, but this symbolic processing, symbolic procedure, it's very important for giving people who suffered from these crimes the feeling that there will not be impunity. And of course, when we speak about Ukrainian crimes, I think it's been a little bit exaggerated to say and compare them to Russian crimes, because most of the Russian crimes we could see openly on the pictures from Bucha, from Irpin, many killed children, and there were no such evidence of crimes from Ukrainian side.
And just for info, this month, Ukraine said it was examining more than 21,000 war crimes and crimes of aggression allegedly committed by Russian forces since the start of the invasion in February. And here we could only raise the question if Russia could actually be prosecuted over the war in Ukraine. While the Kremlin denies all war crimes or that it has been targeting civilians, it has regularly blamed Ukraine for shelling its own infrastructure and killing its own civilians, accusations which have been widely dismissed by international leaders. Mr. Greg Simon, how can we find out the truth in here?
Well, one can see there are a number of witness testimonies from Ukrainian civilians living in those areas that, yes, Ukraine has been committing war crimes, holding people as human shields, shelling civilian areas. I mean, it's like these ridiculous accusations that Russia is shelling Donetsk and these places which are in its control. So there is a lot of propaganda and disinformation, not only by Russia, but certainly by Ukraine and the United States and its backers. So, I mean, you have this fog of war. And if we look at previous war crimes, I mean, they don't often get any kind of satisfaction in terms of recent war crimes. I mean, look what the US has been doing in Iraq, Syria, and so forth. These are going unanswered. And then it's the case is normally war crimes are held when a side loses, such as Nazi Germany or Japan. Russia is not losing this war. So how are you going to effectively run these war crimes tribunals when there is no trust between the different sides, and then there's questions of jurisdiction and so forth?
What about you, Mr. Franak? Is there any possibility that Ukraine is using its own civilians as a human shield? I mean, at war, everything is allowed. Although it seems as medieval, I mean, it can't get as medieval as this, but in war, everything is allowed. How do you think this could be true? Is there any likelihood?
This is the Russian propagandist narrative. They're trying to justify their aggression towards Ukraine, saying that it's Ukrainian government who are Nazi, who are killing their own people. But look at the service, look at the Ukrainian population. They are peaceful. They didn't intend to do whatever on the border with Russia. They were not ready for this war at all. And Ukrainians in general, they are targets in this war from Russia. I don't think there is any sense, any logic, any rationality to say that Ukrainians commit any war crimes on large or significant scale, but we definitely see evidence of massive Russian crimes committed all over Ukraine, bombing from Belarus territory and from airspace of Ukrainian cities. Even from Belarus territory, they use Belarusian land where they place missiles, and they launch these missiles from my country towards Ukrainian cities, and many people are dying.
And in a different development, the head of Russian diplomacy, Sergei Lavrov, arrived Sunday evening in Oyo, in the north of Congo, where he began the second leg of his African tour, which began in Cairo, in Egypt. President Sassou Nguesso and Minister Sergei Lavrov will hold face-to-face talks tonight. Mr. Franak, again, Lavrov has dismissed claims that Moscow caused the global food crisis. He said in Cairo that Western nations were distorting the truth about the impact of sanctions on global food security. How true do you think is this?
Definitely, Russia is interested to create the global food crisis, to raise stakes, but also to make its position stronger in possible negotiations. They can sell their position like, okay, we're allowed to export grain from Ukraine, but you should agree that Ukraine will lose part or half of its territory. Russia, in this case, it is a beneficiary of the global food crisis. It becomes more important player, and every world leader or international organization leader supposed to go to Russia to discuss it. And Ukraine is very important because Ukraine is one of the biggest supplier of grain in the world.
And since Russia can actually use the card of food crisis, don't you think that Ukraine could use it as well, perhaps to put more pressure on Western nations, Mr. Franak?
Ukraine will not do this because Ukraine is keeping the moral position here. They will not make people from other countries, other regions to suffer because of Ukraine. They do all possible to export grain from its silos, from its territory as soon as possible. And they collaborate actively with international organizations, with Secretary Guterres, with Turkish government, who kindly agreed to become a mediator. So Ukraine definitely is interested to sell this grain and to stop this food crisis.
And Dr. Greg Simons, how do you find the comments of our distinguished guest? And what can you tell us about Lavrov accusing the Western nations of trying to impose their dominance over other nations? Much of the Arab world and Africa is badly affected by the grain shortages caused by Russia's war in Ukraine. How true are these?
If we look at it, even before the 24th of February, there was already discourse in Western media and political circles that there is a looming food crisis. So the war is not the cause of the food crisis. It might contribute to it, but it is not the cause. And if we look at the policies, like, for example, what we're seeing in Netherlands, where the Dutch government has been threatening to take farms, where the British government has been paying farmers to retire. I mean, these different policies, they're not solving the food crisis, they're exacerbating it. So, I mean, it just doesn't make sense. And of course, I mean, if we look in the bigger scale of this particular conflict, I mean, it's mostly the biggest resonance is in the Western-centric world. That is the US-led liberal democratic bloc, if we want to call it this. I mean, if we look at countries from the non-Western centric world, those in Africa, Middle East, Latin America, Asia, they have an utterly different view and perspective on this particular Ukrainian conflict and what are the causes of it. So it's a lot of this is representation of events and trends in this particular war.
And Dr. Greg Simons, how do you find the comments that Sergei Lavrov made about his country having been always there for African countries, and they have always sincerely supported Africans in their struggle for freedom from the colonial oppression? So how do you think this is going to help Russia get more people to align in their, let's say, line?
Well, I mean, as I just said, a lot of countries and people beyond this Western-centric world either are neutral or positive towards Russia. So, I mean, most of this stuff, which was looking at these highly negative attitudes of Russia, are within this US-dominated zone of influence in the world. I mean, EU, North America, Australasia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, these kinds of countries. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, not only Russia, but the Soviet Union before it, of course, spent decades in terms of developing its soft power and relational interactions with the non-Western world. So they do have a more positive attitude.
And Mr. Franak, Lavrov's trip, according to analysts, comes at a sensitive time. And analysts say that Russia is planning to use Africa to its own benefits. How do you read it?
So it's there are many ways how African countries, African allies of Russia can help it. First of all, they have votes in international organizations, and they can help voting for a specific position or blocking a specific position. Second, some African countries can help to avoid sanctions. Russia and Lukashenko's regime in Belarus suffer a lot from sanctions, and having partners in Southeast Asia, in Africa and Latin America can open the loopholes. They can basically become the mediators in the trade chain, and it creates possibility both for buying sanctioned goods but also for selling sanctioned goods. And in general, I think for Lavrov it's very important, and for Putin it's very important to demonstrate that they are not alone in this war, because right now very little countries supported publicly Russian invasion, Russian aggression against Ukraine. And by making these diplomatic trips and meetings, they're trying to get more allies on their side.
And Dr. Greg Simons, if we are going to speak about countries that align with Russia or countries that are willing to buy sanctioned goods from Russia, do we expect something, a response from the Western nations perhaps, maybe an embargo on these countries, maybe sanctions?
Well, we've seen the United States trying to pressure and coerce countries, and this is coming from the same country that has been espousing this narrative of national sovereignty in decision-making. For example, we can see when Imran Khan, former Prime Minister of Pakistan, was not condemning Russia, there was a soft coup and he was removed. One can also see a great deal of pressure against India. So, I mean, the non-Western world can see the massive hypocrisy which is being displayed by this US unipolar world, and they're not taking part of it. They are either standing aside or just trying to resist this pressure and coercion.
And Mr. Franak, do you agree that the war in Ukraine did expose the hypocrisy of Western nations?
Somehow not hypocrisy, but I think the cautiousness, not readiness for strong reactions, for strong policies. For many years, the Western democracies were living in peace, in organized, civilized, transparent relationship, and suddenly the times of Cold War came back. And the West just wasn't ready to react swiftly, to be united in having response, and be tough, be firm. And but now this changing. We see that European Union, the United Kingdom, Norway, Switzerland, Canada, United States, and democratic allies around the world, they are trying to develop this strong, unified reaction towards Putin's action in Ukraine.
And let me share with you this, Mr. Franak. Hungary's Prime Minister has said the conflict in Ukraine will only end when peace talks are held between Russia and America. Viktor Orban said sanctions against Moscow have not worked and that the European Union needs a new strategy to end the conflict.
The European Union's task now is not to stand on the side of the Russians or on the side of the Ukrainians, but to stand between Russia and Ukraine. This should be the essence of a new strategy.
So I get back to you, Mr. Franak here. I mean, do you agree with the Hungarian Prime Minister? And what are the new strategies that he's hinting at?
I disagree, because EU and the West must stand on its values. Its values are about democracy, it's about human rights, it's about people's participation. And when one country is attacked by another country, when one country is suffering because some dictator decided to take half of its territory, you shouldn't be in between. You should support those who suffer. And Western countries, the democratic countries around the world, in Africa also, must support Ukraine, because this is not about interest of Moscow or Kiev. It's about the basic human values. It's about democratic principles. And I disagree that sanctions didn't work. Sanctions do work, but sanctions must be comprehensive to be efficient. If it's possible to avoid them, the sanctions will not have effect.
Now, what about you, Dr. Greg Simons? Do you agree with our distinguished guest, and how important are peace talks here, and how likely is drafting a good peace proposal between the two countries?
Well, let's start with these peaceful, civilized European nations and the United States. Of course, Algeria knows full well how civilized the Europeans can be in its war of independence from France. And if we look into the current state, I mean, let's tell how democratic and peaceful they are to Serbia, to Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. I mean, this is just nonsense. They represent themselves as being civilized, but their behavior speaks of something else. And Viktor Orban is absolutely right. Do we want to drag this war on I mean, more Ukrainian civilians will die as a result? Or do we want this resolved? I mean, this is not about principles of high human values. I mean, the US has openly said, I mean, Austin, the Secretary of Defense, has openly said that they're using Ukraine as a mechanism to weaken Russia, to contain Russia. And he's not the only one, Blinken and others. So, I mean, Orban is right. The sanctions have been an utter disaster. I mean, they're affecting the EU much worse and the United States much worse than they are Russia. So instead of acknowledging the mistakes, of course, the EU is not free to choose its own strategic path. I mean, it's dependent on the US, and it just doubles down on stupid.
Very nice indeed. Dr. Greg Simons, thank you so much. And Dr. Fanak Vikorka, thank you so much. You were live with us. Thank you for your thorough analysis, and thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All24 News. For more updates, follow us on those social media, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Bye for now.